Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream are made possible by the generous support of PNC and the Raskin Family Fund, with additional funding from Cleveland State University, Robert Conrad, and the Payne Fund.
Good afternoon and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. I'm Dan Polster, United States District Court. It's my pleasure to give the introduction today. I've never started with a gong. I have a gavel, which I generally don't use, but not a gong. So it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dale Russakoff, author of the prize, Who's in Charge of America's Schools? In late 2015, after the birth of his daughter, Facebook founder and CEO Mark Zuckerberg announced a pledge to donate 99% of his net worth over the course of his lifetime. He established a limited liability corporation rather than a charitable trust for dissemination of the funds, a move that evoked some criticism. It wasn't the first time Mr. Zuckerberg had faced criticism for his philanthropic endeavors. In 2010, he, together with then New Jersey Mayor Cory Booker and Governor Chris Christie, announced a $100 million pledge to transform the Newark Public School District, the largest and one of the lowest performing districts in the state of New Jersey. The goal was to, quote, turn Newark into a symbol of educational excellence for the whole nation, unquote. Over the ensuing 5 years, $200 million was spent on the initiative, with some positive results, but nothing close to the promised transformation of public schooling. The first question to ask is, what went wrong? It also begs a larger question. Is there a place for philanthropy in our public education system? No one knows more about the initiative to transform the Newark Public School District than our speaker, Dale Russakoff. Dale spent 28 years as a reporter for the Washington Post, covering politics, education, and social policy. From 1994 to 2008, she served in the Post's New York Bureau, which covered the Mid-Atlantic region, including Newark, New Jersey. After Mr. Zuckerberg announced his gift on the Oprah Winfrey Show, Ms. Russakoff embedded herself in Newark, getting a front row seat to what many thought would be an historic attempt to fight a failing public school. She followed the initiative for 4 years, and her observations, originally serialized in The New Yorker, became the New York Times best-selling book, The Prize, Who's in Charge of America's Schools? Praised by critics, the prize furthers the national conversation on urban public education. The Atlantic's Andrew Simmons writes, quote, without taking an ideological stance in the contentious public debates about the direction of education in America, Russakoff shows readers how a dreamy, seeming union of idealists, money, and opportunity might breed confusion and conflict as readily as hope and renewal. She underscores the maddening complexities of reinvigorating and managing a struggling school system in a downtrodden urban area, unquote. A native of Birmingham, Alabama, Ms. Russakoff attended public schools and graduated from Harvard University, where Dale and I met. I won't say how many years ago. You can probably look it up with either of us, but a long time ago, and it's great to renew the friendship. She started her journalism career in Alabama, working at the Alabama Journal and the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Ladies and gentlemen, members and friends of the City Club of Cleveland, please join me in welcoming Dale Russakoff.
Well, I'd like to thank Dan for the introduction and the City Club for the great hospitality. It's really fantastic to be here, and I know that I learned a little bit about the august speakers that come here, so I'm even more honored than I thought I was to be here. Many of you probably remember the huge media swirl 5 years ago around the announcement that Mark Zuckerberg was committing $100 million to turn around the deeply troubled schools of Newark, New Jersey. It was sensational on lots of levels. It was the king-sized amount of money. It was a 26-year-old billionaire. It was the fact that it was announced on the Oprah Winfrey Show. There was the involvement of Cory Booker, a star-quality African-American urban Democratic mayor, and Chris Christie, then a star-quality white suburban Republican governor. At the time, he was a rising star in his party. They made astounding promises. They said they were going to do what no one had done before, take an impoverished urban school district with very high rates of failure and transform it into one of uniformly high performance. And they weren't going to stop there. They said that in 5 years, they would emerge with a model for how to turn around not only Newark, but any struggling urban school district. Mark Zuckerberg was hoping to take this model to city after city, using his philanthropy to solve the crisis of educational opportunity afflicting needy children in America. As you may have heard, it didn't quite work out as planned. Zuckerberg did not emerge from Newark with a model even for turning around Newark. Some good things have in fact happened as a result of the expenditure of $100 million and a second $100 million in matching gifts from other donors. But the hoped-for proof point, as they called it, that's startup language, but they applied it to education too. The proof point for how education reform can lift children out of crushing poverty did not materialize, nor was it really reasonable to expect it to. How could a district that had been in decline for 5 decades turn into what Cory Booker predicted would be a hemisphere of hope in 5 years? Changing an entire city's education system takes decades, not years. It takes reckoning with extensive effects of poverty on children's lives and minds. And it also takes leaders who will stay with the work for a generation. Booker and Christie were thinking on a politician's timeline, 5 years. And in fact, before the 5 years elapsed, both of them had moved on to other things. Booker to the Senate, Christie to the presidential race. We know how that went. There is lots to learn from what happened in Newark, particularly about the complex and essential work of improving the capacity of urban schools to educate the nation's poorest children. These schools feel the weight of poverty in America as intimately as any of our institutions. And at the same time, education is our best hope of equipping the next generation to overcome poverty. In that light, I'd like to reflect on what Newark teaches us about the education reform movement and what it does and doesn't offer children in the poorest cities, about how difficult it is to change a school district given all the entrenched interests inside of it, and a lesson Mark Zuckerberg learned the hard way, how critical it is for any philanthropist to know the city he or she is trying to help. Actually, Mark Zuckerberg did not mastermind any of the strategies that unfolded in Newark. He had met Cory Booker 2 months earlier, before the Oprah announcement, and was swept off his feet by him. The Newark schools had been under the control of the state for 15 years at the time, the result of an investigation that found rampant corruption and appalling neglect of students. When Booker told Zuckerberg that he and Christie could use the governor's absolute powers over the schools and Booker's own bully pulpit to launch an education revolution, the young Facebook founder felt they were singing his song. He said on Oprah that he was just doing what he would do in private business, identifying great leaders and investing in them. Zuckerberg told me later that he thought he was supporting what the majority of people in Newark wanted for themselves. But interestingly, no one consulted the people on the ground in Newark in planning a complete transformation of their children's schools. Newark parents and teachers learned of the $100 million gift at the same moment as Oprah's national television audience. No one who had taught in the Newark schools, had a child in the Newark schools, or had attended the Newark schools had input into the reform plan. The initial agenda was drawn up by McKinsey consultants at the request of then Mayor Booker. It mirrored the agenda of the education reform movement, that very potent combination of billionaire philanthropists, charter school leaders, social entrepreneurs, and politicians in both parties who are seeking to upend the status quo of traditional public schools governed by large, usually unionized bureaucracies. The goals were rapidly expand charter schools, close failing district schools, build a state-of-the-art data system with which to hold everyone accountable, relax tenure and seniority protections so as to eliminate the weakest teachers, and create a pipeline of new teachers through non-traditional training programs like Teach for America. Zuckerberg's personal priority was a new teacher's contract that would no longer reward teachers for seniority, but would give large merit bonuses to the teachers whose students improved the most on the state standardized test. When I interviewed him, he told me that he thought of this in terms of Facebook. He thought of his own workforce and the fact that he could attract the finest, most competitive people in the world to Facebook. And he said he couldn't have done it if he wasn't able to reward them based on their performance, not based on seniority. So he figured, how could this not be true for public schools? They have this great mission, they have this great challenge. How could they overcome it, he said, if they didn't have the same tools he did? And I think it's interesting, these philanthropists who've gotten so involved in education in the last 15 years come from, these companies like Facebook, Microsoft, companies that sprung up overnight almost and changed the world, and they actually think that education can change the same way that their businesses did. And there's a real disconnect between what they know about business and what they know about education in the communities where kids are living. But as I said, a number of good things came of the effort. New principals were installed, and some of them brought real energy, vision, and stronger instructional leadership to their schools. A new teacher evaluation system was created, and the principals I talked to said they felt it was much more helpful in describing and defining good teaching, making it possible for them to coach their teachers to be more effective. Also, they did reach a new teacher's contract agreement, and for the first time, annual raises in Newark are now conditioned on teachers being rated effective or highly effective. Teachers who are rated ineffective no longer get a raise. And they now have numbers showing that something like 40% of the teachers who are rated partially effective or ineffective are leaving the district. So the contract is doing something of what they had hoped to do in, getting the least qualified people to leave. The reform effort also dramatically expanded charter schools. While charter schools nationally do not outperform traditional public schools, in Newark they do. Within the next couple of years, 40% of Newark children will be attending charters. That's more than twice the percentage at the time that Zuckerberg made his gift. And a group in Seattle called the Center for Reinvention of Public Education reported recently that among urban communities nationally, Newark now has one of the highest proportions of its children attending schools that beat the state average on standardized tests. That's the state average for urban districts, not the overall state average. And the center said that that's largely because of the performance of charter schools. But something big was missing from these strategies. There was no plan to address the consequences of poverty that permeate the classrooms of Newark's district schools. In fact, an early email that went between Zuckerberg and Booker said, MZ's money will not go to the classroom. Their whole idea was to, reform the systems that manage the district and somehow have that trickle down into higher student performance without looking at the real circumstances the kids were coming from every day into the classroom. In Newark, 45% of children live below the poverty line. That's 2 times the national average. And the consequences begin unbelievably early. 40% of babies born in Newark have had no prenatal care or inadequate prenatal care. So they're disadvantaged before they even draw their first breath. At a series of 10 community forums soon after the Zuckerberg gift was announced, residents were invited to share what they believed it would take to fix the Newark schools. I went to all 10 forums, and the most consistent plea from parents and teachers was that children needed more support at the classroom level, more social workers, more counselors, and more teachers to overcome the trauma of unstable home lives, witnessing violence, and living in deep poverty. Some adults even broke down crying as they talked about what children endured in their lives outside of school. But in another example of how little weight the reformers gave to the residents of Newark, none of those recommendations made their way into the reform strategy. As a matter of fact, the community engagement campaign was managed by a political consultant from New York City. He was prominent in the charter school movement, and he knew nothing about Newark. In fact, he and his staff had, sometimes they would have presentations, and they consistently gave people like me and other reporters the wrong address because they didn't even know their way around Newark. He was ultimately paid almost $2 million from the city's philanthropic bounty. And one of the board members of the foundation that paid the bill said very disapprovingly that his effort amounted to public relations, not community engagement. Now, I should be clear, the Newark schools were in serious need of reform at the time of Mark Zuckerberg's gift. In fact, there was wide consensus in the community that the status quo was absolutely unacceptable. Only 40% of children were reading at their grade level. Only 54% were graduating high school. And of those who did graduate and attend the local community college, more than 90% needed to take remedial classes before qualifying for college-level work. You know, the reform movement has a mantra. It goes, poverty is an excuse for the failures of traditional public schools in Newark and in cities across the country. That is unquestionably true for some people in some schools. But as I witnessed continually for 4.5 years, poverty is also a root cause of failure for children who literally are traumatized from growing up amid violence, family strife, and constant instability. Here's an example from my reporting. Avon Avenue School is located in one of the poorest catchment areas in Newark. I regularly attended a kindergarten class there of 26 children, of whom 15 had child welfare cases. Alleged neglect, exposure to violence, exposure to drugs, more than half the children in the class. Some of the children in that class were already so emotionally damaged and so angry at age 5 that they were hitting other children and throwing chairs. So not only were they unable to learn, but their classmates were often so frightened that they weren't able to learn either. That class had one of the best teachers in any Newark charter or district school, but on many days her extraordinary skills were not enough to overcome those challenges. She didn't need excuses. She needed help. I also spent time in Spark Academy, a KIPP elementary school. Spark had some students, although not as many, nowhere near as many, actually, who were equally troubled. They also had way more resources to support them and their teachers. They had 2 teachers in classrooms from kindergarten through 3rd grade. Avon Avenue had 1. They had a tutor for every grade to support children who couldn't keep up, even with 2 teachers. And they had 3 social workers who did therapy with a total of 70 children a week, while Avon had the equivalent of 1 social worker who was busy full-time just filing paperwork on 700 children. And Spark had a dean of students and family engagement. That's a position you won't find in the school district. Her job was to make sure there was an adult in every child's life to support that child's learning, if not a parent, a family friend, a godparent. The principal of Spark said there was no way the school could have had the academic results it did without those extra resources. In other words, a high-performing charter school would not have been high-performing if it had to rely on the budget that reaches the traditional district schools. The Newark district spends $18,000 to $20,000 per student on average, but only $8,000 got to Avon Avenue School to pay teachers, counselors, social workers, tutors, principals, vice principals, and security guards. The Spark principal, by contrast, had $12,000, half again as much money, and that actually did not include philanthropy. It was all public dollars. The Newark district has incredibly steep costs for aging facilities. The average building in Newark, school building, is over 80 years old. And they have very high costs for special education. So that was some of the difference. But like districts in many old industrial cities, it was used for generations to do much more than educate children. It has variously been a patronage pit for local political bosses and also an employer of last resort in a very impoverished city. I named my book The Prize because control of the school district, with its $1 billion budget, has been viewed for generations as a prize by politicians and power brokers in Newark. At the time I started my research, the district had 7,000 employees, the biggest payroll in Newark, with the single exception of United Airlines, which is headquartered in Newark, at the airport. As large as Mark Zuckerberg's gift sounded, when calculated over its 5-year term, it came to only 2% a year of what the district already was spending. Trying to streamline the school district bureaucracy to get more money to schools and classrooms is a political third rail in Newark and in most inner cities, given the extremes of poverty and unemployment. the prize of the school district is much less of a prize than it used to be, because there's been tremendous cutbacks in the school district in concert with the growth of charter schools. But still, laying off school district workers, means eliminating secure jobs with benefits in a city with very few of them. And it could also mean destabilizing the families of children in the Newark Public Schools. More recently, the district schools in Newark are facing a serious financial crisis, a new one, from the growth of the charter sector. As children leave for charters, the money goes with them. And for all sorts of complicated reasons that you probably know here in Cleveland, school districts simply can't downsize as fast as charters grow. In Newark, schools have been closed, consolidated, and repurposed, and thousands of children have had to move to new schools amid the upheaval. Critical support services, already in short supply for students with deep social and emotional needs, are being cut year after year. Booker and Christie, surprisingly, did not plan for this eventuality, nor have their counterparts in cities across the country where charter schools are expanding. Cammie Anderson, the superintendent until last June, warned them early and often that the district was going to be decimated, to no avail. When I asked Cory Booker at the outset of the reform effort how failing schools would turn into high-performing schools, he said, and I quote, "They'll melt into many different school models. They're going to flower, just like the cherry blossoms in Branch Brook Park." Yes, it's worth chuckling at. Clearly, he and no one had a roadmap for the treacherous path from failure to utopia. In the district schools, which still enroll 60% of the children in Newark, student performance on the state standardized test went down, not up, in the first 5 years. This last year, for the first time, there was an upturn. And I'm hoping that that's because all of this churning and upheaval is over and it's better, students have a better shot at actually focusing. But there's a stark contrast here. The charter schools with 40% of Newark children are beating the odds, while the district schools with 60% of the children are struggling. There's evidence that this problem has prompted some soul-searching in the education reform movement. A prominent scholar in the movement actually said to me that there should be a pottery barn rule for proponents of disruptive change in school districts. As she put it, you broke it, you bought it. But it'll take a lot of soul-searching and flexibility among all the players in education for that to happen. Another issue in Newark, which was a big one, was the effort to impose reforms from the top down on a city with deep and justified suspicions of wealthy outsiders. Now, as I told you, there was already a very strong consensus on the ground in Newark that the status quo was unacceptable, that the schools needed to change. But rather than mobilize that consensus and work with it, the reformers basically came in with their own plan and imposed it on the city. Going back to the days of urban renewal and white flight, Newark residents had developed what one councilman described to me as extreme xenophobia, fearful that white people, having fled Newark in the 1960s, would return one day to take what little remained from them. The reform effort played directly into this narrative. Other than Booker, its architects were all white and from outside of Newark. As I said, no one who had taught in the Newark schools or had a child in the Newark schools was consulted in the crafting of the agenda. Booker and the other leaders hired consultants to design this reform effort, and almost all of them were white, none from Newark, and most of them were paid $1,000 a day, so that the total bill for consultants was $20 million out of the $200 million, 10% of the money. The existence of these consulting contracts made big news when the Star-Ledger, the local newspaper, was leaked a document drawn up by one of the consulting firms proposing to close a number of district schools and turn them over to charter schools. Nothing about closing district schools or expanding charter schools had come up at any of the 10 public forums that were supposed to engage Newark residents in the reform effort. 600 people overflowed the next school board meeting demanding answers. A leading citizen of Newark who grew up in the city said to the mayor, "This is the Newark nightmare. We drank it with our mother's milk." More than a third of schools were eventually closed, consolidated, restaffed, turned over to charters, or redesigned. And if you can imagine this, without parents having an opportunity to weigh in on how these changes would affect their children. At one point, a leading pastor warned Governor Christie that the city was so inflamed that he feared a recurrence of the 1967 riots. The anger found its way into the mayor's race and helped propel Raz Baraka, a city councilman and a school principal who was running against the reforms, into office as Mayor Booker's successor. The reform movement during the election raised more than $5 million to try to defeat him. That's more than 6 times what he spent on his whole election campaign. And he still won decisively because the community was so allied behind him. Sorry. Now, this is one of the, the polarization over education was one of the reasons that I really wanted very strongly to write this book. The battle over Newark is in many ways a microcosm of a larger national battle over the future of education. When I began my reporting, the movie Waiting for Superman had just premiered. As you may recall, it portrayed traditional urban schools as dropout factories and championed charter schools as the solution. 2 websites went online immediately. One was called waitingforsuperman.org, the other notwaitingforsuperman.org. I was struck by how many real needs of children both sides, the reformers and their opponents, were leaving out. And I felt that this debate, this impassioned debate about education in our country, had a hole in the middle of it. And most of the children of Newark and of urban districts everywhere were stranded in that hole. So I actually thought that this was an opportunity for journalism. I thought if I could write a comprehensive account of how both the status quo and the reforms in one representative urban school district were affecting all children in charter schools and district schools, that this would be a contribution worth making. I wanted to see education from every perspective in the debate, but most importantly from the eye view of children and the teachers who worked every day to reach them against incredible odds. If I could write a story, a book, about education reform in Newark that was indisputably true and thorough, essentially filling in the hole that existed in both sides of the national conversation, I hope that it could spur a more honest exchange about what children and schools in cities like Newark truly need to succeed. Now, in this very polarized conversation about education, there's a raging debate over whether you can improve urban school districts without first solving poverty. My reporting convinces me that you actually don't have to solve poverty to improve education for the poorest kids, but you definitely have to address it. And to address it, you need to maximize resources at the school level, a major political challenge that will require the cooperation of every force in education. I would like to return to the KIPP elementary school that I mentioned, Spark Academy, to tell you about something I witnessed that clarified this for me. Now, this is not because this is a charter school, but it's because they had adequate resources and they used them so effectively to address the needs their students had. One morning late in 2011, a mother of 3 students at the school was badly beaten by her boyfriend while her children were in school. The mother appeared in the school office. Her face was bleeding and swollen. She was clutching her newborn baby, whose skull had been fractured, and she was desperate for help. The principal, Joanna Belcher, accompanied her and the baby to the hospital, persuaded her to file a police report, and accompanied her to the courthouse, where they sat together for hours waiting for a lawyer to be assigned. The lawyer who ultimately was assigned told me, "I had never seen that in all my career, a principal coming to court with a victim." But what was even more unusual was what happened back at the school, where the Dean of Student and Family Engagement took up the case. This is the position I told you about earlier that is unheard of in most district schools, a dean responsible for developing individualized help for children who are struggling because of issues outside the classroom. The dean created a carpooling schedule involving 7 different staff members who would pick up the 3 children each morning at a neutral location. The family had been relocated to a shelter, and that shelter had to be kept secret. So the location of the shelter had to be kept secret. So they would pick them up at this neutral location every morning and then return them each day after school. And remember the 3 social workers who did therapy for 70 children a week suffering from emotional distress? The lead social worker counseled the children in this family and also guided their teachers on how to speak with them about the traumatic experience to help them feel safe and able to learn. Not one of those children missed even one day of school throughout their months in the shelter, and all of them finished that school year above grade level. I talked about this with the district kindergarten teacher whose class of 26 had 15 children with child welfare cases and none of the support available in the charter school, and this is how she put it to me. We have to ask of every school, what does this particular school need to meet the challenges of the neighborhood it's situated in? And then we simply have to find the courage and the money to provide it. We have to be able to show children, why is this education meaningful? How can you possibly do that if other things are not working? Now, since Mark Zuckerberg made this gift to Newark 6 years ago, I think there have actually been some shifts in the education reform movement, noticeable shifts. The New Schools Venture Fund, which is one of the big philanthropies, it's out in Silicon Valley. They fund charter schools and entrepreneurial solutions, private sector solutions to education. They devoted an annual meeting a year ago almost entirely to talking about the importance of understanding the communities in which they work and of diversifying their own ranks. They were very, if you go to their conferences, they're all white and all wealthy, and they're all working, they're supposedly working to try to resolve the problems of Black and brown children in the poorest communities. And so, they talked about the need to not just be preaching to the communities, but to be listening to them and to be incorporating their ideas into what they're doing. You probably know Teach for America, which started out recruiting white elite college students almost, to the exclusion of others, is now more than half of its teachers are now non-white, and a large number of them now come from the communities where they're working. So that's been another change. And the KIPP schools actually invited me to come to their annual conference in August, and they had me talk to their funders, their board of trustees of their foundation, and tell them what the costs had been for the community in Newark of imposing reform from the top down. So I thought that was really an interesting thing, that they wanted their funders to hear that. And in Newark itself, there have been some really, very positive changes, I think. There's a lot less talk about transformation and disruption and all of these business ideas, and a lot more focus on making sure that schools run well and for the benefit of kids. A little over a year ago, basically alarmed by the uprising that was going on in Newark, Governor Christie announced that he would return the schools over the next year or two to the control of the local people. It's now been 20 years that the Newark district schools have been controlled by the state with very little to show for it. Although I think, as I said, I think some positive things have happened recently. And I think another really interesting thing that's happened as a result of Newark is that Mark Zuckerberg has changed. In December last year, after 5 years of basically an approach that said we're just going to change the management systems and expect that to solve the problems of urban education, he and his wife announced that they were giving the remaining $10 to $15 million of their gift after, almost 200 million of the combined gift had been spent. They set up a program to create 5 community schools in the poorest ward in Newark. These are schools, what they call community schools in Newark are schools that have wraparound services for the children and for the community and the adults. So there's a medical clinic, there will be a medical clinic, mental health services, after-school programs for kids and programs for adults in the community. It's basically, the idea is you don't just educate and teach inside the building, but you try to treat the neighborhood. It's a very ambitious, idealistic idea and very different from what they were doing before. I think, as you know, as Dan said, Mark Zuckerberg and his wife Priscilla Chan announced at the same time, actually, as they made this announcement in Newark, that they're going to give away 99% of their Facebook stock, equivalent to $45 billion, over the course of their lifetimes. And they are going to give it to education, anti-poverty efforts, global disease, global health, and trying to resolve the issue of broken communities in the most impoverished areas. So if you think about it, of the three men who sat on Oprah's stage 6 years ago, only one is still in the fray. Cory Booker left first in 2013 when he decided to run for the Senate. Christie left, and Mark Zuckerberg is kind of the last man standing. And when he and his wife made this announcement that they're giving away 99% of their Facebook stock, they also released 6 principles that they're going to use to guide their giving. And the first 2 were taken directly from lessons learned the hard way in Newark. The first one was that they will they will not invest for the short term ever again, that they'll only invest for the long term, like 25 years, even 50 years. And they said that short-term thinking cannot solve the large, great problems of our time. The second principle was that they will make sure that they engage the people whose lives they hope to change. And I think their quote was, you can't empower people if you don't engage them. So those, considering how much money is going to be spent in an effort to make the world a better place under their auspices, I would say that those are really important changes. And you know, they came about because of what they learned in the very tough educational precincts of Newark, New Jersey. So that's all I have to say for now, and take your questions.
Wonderful. Can you hold on to that for
Yeah.
a second? You can
Yeah.
leave your notes if you want.
Do I stay?
Okay, yeah, just right there. Thanks, that's fine. Hello, I'm Dan Moulthrop, Chief Executive here at the City Club of Cleveland. Today we're enjoying a forum with Dale Russakoff, author of The Prize, Who's in Charge of America's Schools? We're about to begin the Q&A with all of you, and we welcome questions from everyone, City Club members, guests, students, and those of you joining us via our webcast. If you'd like to tweet a question, please tweet it at the City Club, and our staff will work it into the program. We want to remind you that your questions should be brief, to the point, and in fact questions. Holding the microphones today are Content Coordinator Teddy Eisenberg and our Director of Programming, Stephanie Jansky. May we have our first question, please?
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for coming. I really liked your book. And please forgive me, I have a political question to ask you. You document very well in your book Cory Booker's mixed record as mayor of Newark. And given that mixed record, are you at all surprised that he's now a senator and is still a national political rock star?
You know, I'm not, because he had a real talent for projecting himself nationally, quite apart from what was happening in Newark. And you know, it was kind of like if he didn't tweet it, it didn't happen. And one thing that Cory Booker is a really gifted and very, very bright man. And I think one of his great talents is drawing national attention to the issues that he thinks are important, and by extension, national attention to himself. So he's continued to do that, and he has, you know, over the years, his whole story was really the story he told about himself, and not the story that anybody followed up and looked at back home. And so he became a national hero, and I think that that's carried him all this way. He has a tremendous fundraising base, you know, nobody in New Jersey had, you know, when he was running for the Senate, had a fundraising base compared to his. You know, I guess I'm not that, I really wasn't at all surprised that he won the Senate race. And as you probably noticed, you know, like a lot of people who go to the Senate with a lot of fame already, they sort of put their heads down, and they become more of like workhorses and don't hog the limelight as much, and he's followed that. I mean, Hillary Clinton did that, Al Franken, the comedian who is a senator now, and I think he followed their lead.
We're at a time when there are metrics, it seems, for everything. And I'm curious about a metric which I don't even know exists. Can you tell from your work in the district whether the public schools, the traditional public school system of Newark, has more or less citizen engagement, both within the city as a whole and within the state as a whole, than it had when this began?
I don't have any metrics for that, but I definitely don't think they have more. I think that there are some principals, individual principals, who are really good at engaging their parents and their community, and I've seen that happen, and it has really good effects. But I think that, for the first 3 or 4 years of this effort, people felt alienated from the schools, and they spent all their time kind of fighting to stop the process. And in a way, that was engagement, I guess. People. But I have to say, it was striking to me that there had never been that level of outrage and mobilization during all the years that the schools were failing so badly. Why wasn't there outrage about the failure of the schools? The real outrage came when somebody tried to come in and take control of them, But I do think that when there is local control in Newark, there'll be a huge, because of this whole process that has made community engagement something kind of precious in Newark, since they didn't have it, I think there will be a lot more when the schools are locally controlled again.
Good afternoon. When you talked about the teacher compensation model changing to more performance-based, was there an accepted measurement of performance or student learning, or was there a huge debate of how the measurement occurred?
Well, they came up with a new teacher evaluation system that was approved along with the contract. And it, interestingly, it doesn't emphasize test scores at all. It's called, teacher effectiveness. And they had all these measures of, whether the teacher was reaching all the kids in the class or just certain kids, and if children didn't understand a lesson, they were checking for understanding. If they didn't understand, they tried a new strategy. There were all these very kind of specific things that teachers were supposed to do to, provide effective teaching, and that the evaluators are supposed to be watching the students as much as the teachers to see if that was working. But what the principals seemed to like about it was it really had very specific definitions of, if a teacher is checking for understanding or not. If children aren't understanding, what are they doing to change their strategies, and to make sure that kids are understanding. And there were so many hundreds of things like that in the evaluation system that sort of guided how you observe a teacher and then how you coach that teacher to become a more effective teacher. And so it was that system that they used to rate the teachers. And they had these 4 ratings: highly effective, effective, partially effective, ineffective. And it was the highly effective teachers were the ones who got those performance bonuses. There wasn't a huge fight over it, to tell you the truth. A lot of teachers were involved in it, in drafting it, so.
How did the newcomers, the immigrants, the English as a second language kids, how did they fare through all this?
The problem was that there was very little attention to them or to special needs students. There was a lot of talk about it, but I think Newark and a lot of the urban districts in New Jersey have a high percentage of kids with special needs. They have, I think there may be, well, I was going to say 9% English language learners, but that might be wrong. But anyway, there's just so little consistency between what these students' plans say they need and what these students actually get. And that problem was not solved at all. It's still a challenge.
Hi, good afternoon. You mentioned the funding difference between charters and districts, and I'm interested in knowing more about that, because in Ohio it's totally different, where charters are getting less than the district schools.
Well, the charters get less to begin with. The district schools get 18 to 20,000. The charters get 16 to 18,000. But what was striking to me was when you go to a charter school, the KIPP schools, and then there's another group of schools that are also part of a national network. If you just look in the classroom, and there's more teachers, there's social workers in and out of the classroom. And I was trying to figure out why that is. Because, as I said, this one school that was in the poorest catchment area was getting only $8,000 to run the, to pay everybody in the school. The charter principal was getting $12,000. And, there are tremendous costs in Newark because of the facilities being so old and this very high rate of special ed students, some of them with very severe disabilities that cost a lot of money. But it doesn't seem to make that much of a difference between $8,000 and $12,000. And my greatest frustration was that I couldn't even begin to figure out where that money was going or where that money even was. And I was talking to the superintendent and I said, you really need like a forensic accountant to figure this out. It was beyond, but I really feel like that was the biggest flaw for me in my reporting was I was not able to come up with the explanation.
Hi.
Hi.
Your book was a wonderful reflection on what not to do. So a lot of really great negative lessons. But what did you learn positive? What can we gain from this that does seem to work?
Well, there was one school in the book, a district school, that where the superintendent had appointed this new principal who was a product of, her mother had been a teacher in Newark for 37 years, and she had been teaching in Newark for 10 years, and her family went all the way back, and she had this tremendous trust from the community. And she was the one that I was talking about who, when you asked about community engagement, who got, the entire community around the school, not just the parents in the school, but, churches and residents who didn't have kids in the school engaged. And so my sense is that what might have worked a lot better in Newark is if from the very beginning, rather than getting the money and going on Oprah and announcing that we're going to do this to Newark, I think that if they had just had a quiet period where they could talk to the best teachers and principals in the most challenging schools and find out from them, what do your students need to succeed that you don't have? And build, like these community schools, like build a plan that was based, and I'm not saying don't do the system's reforms, the system did need reform, but, make that a core of what you're doing based on the most respected educators in the city, and draw on, I think, see the city as a resource, draw on the strength that is there instead of bypassing it. And I think that, had the community had they respected the people who were proposing these changes, I think there could have been a lot more, just harmony and support for it.
Hi.
Hi.
My name's Michelle, and I'm with the Cleveland Schools. And I was wondering what kind of similarities would you be able to see from a Democratic mayor, a Republican governor, and a lot of different things happening? And what kind of advice would you give to a district that is 4 years into our reform process, some wins, some losses, and how can we continue to engage the community to make sure that children have a quality school in every neighborhood?
Unfortunately, I read a little bit about Cleveland. I don't feel I know it intimately, certainly as well as I know Newark. But I think that the involvement of the educators themselves as voices to the community and within the reform leadership is huge. And I assume that you're probably doing that. But
Well, we're trying.
yeah.
It takes time.
Yeah, yeah. But, like, for example, I thought when I was working on the book, when I saw what that charter school did with this dean of student and family engagement, whose job it was to get, organize support for children outside of school, I just thought, why doesn't the district do that? Why don't they just, everybody have a dean of student and family engagement? But you do?
Yeah, we're working on it.
Wow. Well, I was thinking if the superintendent told all the schools to do that, and it was sort of coming from the top down and not from the school itself, that there probably wouldn't have been a lot of buy-in. They probably wouldn't have given the job to some amazing person. They probably would have just, and so, it's really hard, I think, to go from having a great idea to making everybody buy into it if it's not their idea. On the one hand, I thought, why aren't they doing that? On the other hand, maybe they had a good reason.
enjoyed your book very much.
Oh, thank you.
A question for you. It looks like everybody else, all the other principals in this, as principal figures, pretty much landed on their feet. What finally happened to Cammie Anderson in all of this? And will your next reporting project be in the area of education?
Cammie Anderson is now doing consulting work on the school-to-prison pipeline, and I know she's working with the District of Columbia. She may be working with other school districts too. But that's kind of a big interest of hers, because if you read the book, you know that she comes from a family that has kids from very troubled backgrounds. She's one of 12 children, 3 of them, from their 3 of them born to the parents, and 9 of them adopted. And the adopted kids all came from the child welfare system, and some of them had been in prison. So it's something she really cares a lot about. And I'm actually working on a magazine article now about undocumented college students. So I'm really interested in that.
Hi.
Hi.
My name is Beverly, and I am retired from the Akron City Schools. I'm not a secretary. I mean, I am a secretary. I'm not a teacher, but I'm an educator. I worked as a secretary. I worked in community relations, and I worked in the curriculum instruction office. And my question is, the things that I've seen from my perspective, when I first started with the Akron Public Schools, Ron Edmonds was in the effective schools business. He was popular then. And he said, we already know all we need to know to educate all children. What we now need to do is to decide to do it. Education is still the great equalizer of the haves and the have-nots. And not effectively educating the poor is yet another way to keep certain segments of the community from progressing. So my question is, how do we move the needle from getting from where it is now to get the powers that be to decide that effectively educating all of our children should be a priority and good for our nation as a whole?
Wow, I wish I knew the answer to that. I agree with you completely. How do we get there's so little public support for, spending more money on education. And I'm not saying that it's about money, but money is part of it, because you need, what I saw that one charter school accomplish, it took money, and they used the money really well. So, but I think that there's this perception that if you put money into public schools, you're throwing it down a rat hole. And I wish there could be more of a realization that, there can be a way of putting money into public schools that becomes a really powerful, tool to support children's learning, because they desperately need it. There was a boy in my book who I wrote a whole chapter on, who was from a really troubled background, and it was at this Avon Avenue school, and he was discovered in 7th grade to be reading at a 2nd grade level. And there was this unbelievable effort within that school to help him, and a special ed teacher just took her own time to work with him every single day on using this reading program, the Wilson Reading Program, that basically took him almost back to the beginning of reading and taught him it's a way of reading. It's a kind of reading instruction that has been successful with kids who failed to learn the traditional, from the traditional curriculum. And he, in 1 year, went from a 2nd grade reader to a 5th grade reader, and he was making so much progress, and he was so excited. It was the first time in his life he'd ever had success in school. And then he went to high school, and he had no support at the high school, and he started to fail again, and he ended up in a gang. He still comes to school occasionally, not very. And it's just like this boy was so fragile, and it took so much to support him. And it just, it has to be consistent, it has to be everywhere, and it wasn't. And It was one of the roughest things that I came across. So I think we need to somehow change our values, and that, I don't know how we do that when we're making America great again, you know.
We're actually going to close with a question from Twitter. Joy wants to know, kind of a technical question about where the Zuckerberg funding went. She wants to know if it went to district schools and charters, and if the charter schools managed, if they were managed by for-profit companies.
Okay. The charter schools in New Jersey are in Newark are nonprofit. The money went, of the $200 million total, the majority of it went to the district schools, but it went to things like paying for the teacher's contract, not to the classroom. So the teacher's contract took a lot of money because they had, the teachers union refused to come to the table unless they were given 3 years of back pay for the years they'd worked without a contract and without raises. So Mark Zuckerberg wrote a check for $31 million just to pay the back pay of the teachers union to get them to the table. And then in addition to that, there was another $30 million that went to incentives to the teachers to switch to the new contract because it, you know, like I said, it didn't have guaranteed raises for seniority anymore. There was another almost $50 million set aside for a new principal's contract, which wasn't negotiated, so that money was not spent. The charter schools got $60 million, that was what they used to expand so much. So it was, you know, most of the money went to public school efforts, but in terms of money going to classrooms, that didn't happen.
Today at the City Club, we are enjoying a forum with Dale Russakoff, author of the prize, Who's in Charge of America's Schools? Ms. Russakoff is here as part of our Education Innovation Series sponsored by Nordson. We are grateful for their support of our education programming. Community partners for today's forum include the Cleveland State University Center for Educational Leadership and the Greater Cleveland School Superintendents Association. We thank you for your partnership. We welcome guests at tables hosted by the Cleveland State University College of Education and Human Services, the Cleveland Transformation Alliance, and NEOEA. Additionally, we welcome students from Gilmore Academy. Student participation in City Club forums is provided by the Loeb Foundation. The sale of Ms. Russakoff's book, The Prize, Who's in Charge of America's Schools, is provided by a cultural exchange. And that brings us to the end of today's forum. Thank you, Ms. Russakoff. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This forum is now adjourned.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.
Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream are made possible by the generous support of PNC and the Raskin Family Fund, with additional funding from Cleveland State University, Robert Conrad, and the Payne Fund.